What's going on, guys? I'm Chris and this is Regular Guy Training. Today we're going to talk about the BE Meyers MAWL-C1. I've had this guy in my hands for roughly a year now. I have collected a lot of data on it. I've used units previous to it before, to include the military version of it, and there is a lot to cover in that it is a fairly good unit, mostly. Why mostly? Well, we'll go ahead and cover that right after a little bit of ad time. Today's video is sponsored by the Sonoran Desert Institute. Have you ever thought about making a living in the firearms industry? If you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, learning about firearms, the Sonoran Desert Institute might just be a good fit for you. To find out more about SDI, visit sdi.edu. Use the link in the description down below or call 480-999-4767 today. And now back to the video. So, the MAWL. If you were to go back about 6 or 7 years ago, this was the undisputed option as the thing that you needed to get in order to properly train with night vision, because basically everything was not good enough for use. And while that wasn't all the way true then, because the D-Ball i2 existed, it certainly was a superior option because, frankly, it just had big leaps forward as far as controls, programmable stuff, and a list of other things that just made it better than a Steiner product, as a for instance. Now, as far as this is concerned, it's actually pretty straightforward and very intelligently designed for the most part. Up front, you have yourself a little turntable-style dial that you could use to switch between different modes. And once you were in a specific mode, you can cycle between a couple more things. For instance, if you took yourself to the IR portion of this, you had IR laser, which is slave to the illuminator, which is great for all things revolving around IR illuminators and that sort of stuff, because no matter how hard you try to center up a PEG 15 illuminator, eventually, based off of just distance, it's going to come off of center. Point is that you have those things slaved together, and once you are in a particular mode, everything that's closer to you is lower power, everything that's further away from you is higher power. So, for instance, if the little tactile slider that you can clearly see on it and slide it toward the rear, that was your lower power stuff. Once you moved itself into its medium range mode, and I say medium range because once you moved into this mode, it doesn't really matter what button you use, they basically function the same, and you can illuminate and laze and hit a target out to 300 with it. So once you had that, you have a little lockout that you further push forward on your slider on, and now that's in essentially your turbo mode, right? So that guy could reach out way further as far as the military version is concerned, but with the C1, I personally just don't see that much of a difference. And frankly, my eyes are pretty light sensitive, and I can tell the difference between contrast and power outputs and that kind of stuff quite easily, and I just don't see that much of a difference on this. So in reality, as far as the C1 is concerned, you only really have 2 modes for this, and that would be your standard and your lower powered stuff, which is fine. So as far as the configuration and how it's designed, I honestly quite like most of this. What a lot of people don't really realize is that this thing is loaded with magnetic sensors. And one of the first ways that you can find that out is to frankly take off your turntable style cap by going over to the IR portion of it, and you can actually see a little takedown lever that you can just push in and that whole unit comes out. Not only are you able to service that once you encounter some crappy weather or whatever, or dust, sand, doesn't matter what it is, you can get in there and service it, but you also start to notice there's not a whole lot of like mechanical looking connections in here, and you start to try and figure out why it is that you can't see any, but it can tell what mode it's in. So the cool part about that is that they took lessons essentially from like dive community and that sort of stuff, where there's a lot of magnetic sensor stuff embedded in the technology with that. And all this really is for those guys is, okay, one less O-ring I have to deal with, one less seal that's gonna fail on me eventually, that sort of deal, and they applied it to this. Now, a lot of people would say that is overkill for like a laser-based unit like this that has to do with night vision shooting, considering their target market is actually guys like SEALs, CAG dudes, Ranger Regiment guys, things like that. This makes perfect sense, right? Because you are going to run into environments like that, and you're going to have to deal with submerging yourself in water, deal with rough environments, that sort of deal, so this makes sense. So as far as its ability to be weatherproof, it's outstanding in that regard. So I'm going to talk about a lot of strengths that it has, and then I'm going to start talking about a few quirks and some things that I just don't really like like all that much about it. We'll just sort of get to a logical conclusion at the end. We'll start with its close range performance, honestly. Its low mode, or its flood, rather, is probably the very best thing I have ever used as far as clearing structures and things like that. Going to low mode for things like PEC 15s or other units that are on the market, it's great, it works, and the second you kick on IR, it sort of floods the whole room anyway, but it's just a completely different environment that you're in when it just feels like the walls have been painted with IR non-compliance and everything is glowing now. It's just a completely different experience. So as far as his performance in that arena, it's uncontested, at least in my eyes. Also, at greater distances, right? Especially in 1+ football fields, so 1, 2, 300 yards, you know, the practical ranges that you would actually engage stuff, because further than 300 you start running into issues with seeing things, but its ability to illuminate, laze, and hit a target at those distances is very, very good too. Its illuminator is very well executed in that way, and its laser is quite well done as well, both in the military and in the civilian markets, because the laser itself, at least from what I've seen so far, and this may have changed, but as far as the laser output is concerned, what I don't see is the lightsaber effect, especially from the C1. Now, depending on the type of environment that you're in, the military market, you see more of a lightsabery effect, especially if you have more atmospheric stuff to deal with. Like if you got high dew point, you're gonna see that friggin' lightsaber. But I like how they've done this, because as far as the C1 is concerned, perfectly okay with its laser output, and I'm honestly kind of interested in the technology that revolves around dealing with the FDA. And from what I understand, it's multiple tiny lasers that colluminate into a larger visualized thing that's in front of your face. So all of them are inside of FDA regs, right? So, you know, good on you. But the cool thing about that is that I personally am just not a huge fan of like PEC 15 laser beam, because having an exact range and distance that connects directly to my face is not what I would refer to as optimal, especially if anyone is remotely close to peer adversary. I'm not a big fan of that personally. And yeah, I can't lasso like a cool guy in the sky with a friggin' lightsaber, but at the same time, being less detectable overall is probably a little bit closer to optimal. So laser output's good, illuminator output's good, close range output is phenomenal, right? Where's the issues? So I actually have quite a few. The first one has to do with ambidexterity. I know a lot of guys are not concerned with this sort of stuff, but I am personally concerned with ambidextrous controls, especially with stuff that I am using in the dark that I need to be able to use left or right-handed, whether or not I'm passive or not passive or whatever. If it's got a switch on it, especially a tape switch, I gotta be able to use it with either set of hands, because especially with a rifle, you can see yourself on the opposite side significantly more than you would with a handgun. The only real options that you run into now is that you basically have to do this really wide-handed clamp all the way around the entire unit, because if you try to fish your thumb on the inside of it to where most of the unit is in the webbing of your hand, that is great in your living room, but the second that you start trying to use it under any real sort of practical set of circumstances where you're dealing with recoil, you're moving and shooting and things like that, it's gonna get to the point where you get knocked off of that button quite a bit. And it's not like I have the tiniest hands on planet Earth either. I wear a medium glove, right? So we can say whatever we want about how friggin' thin I am and how close my bones are to the skin, but the point is that if I wear a medium glove, I should be able to reach that friggin' guy, and using a less awkward method of reaching at least a low power portion of these buttons is now made basically really difficult, because I have to really watch the pressure that I've got on that button. So the only real practical way to do this is to do a gigantic C-clamp over all the stuff you've got mounted on that side. So that's one issue that I do have with it. And yes, this is reversible, but that has nothing to do with being ambidextrous. That just has everything to do with your primary hand, or whatever that is that you're using, right? Left or right side. Number two, this isn't really an issue with me. This is just sort of jank. You have 2 ports for lasers that are slave to your low and high power modes. So if I wanted access to both of those, I need a dual lead switch and a dual pressure pad. Hooray. Now, am I going to use that ever? Absolutely not, because I also have a white light to deal with. But, you know, again, it's not really an issue, it's just sort of jank to me, which I recognize. Look, there's not a whole lot of workaround that you can have here, but it's not all that good, right? So, it is what it is on that front. Now, this isn't an issue at all, but this is a unit that is more akin to have you parallel 0 with the unit, and this makes sense because of just the position of the unit itself. Now, the number one question that you would have to ask is, okay, well, does it still have an issue just via the position of the unit with a converging 0? Because a lot of guys just prefer that, and sometimes you're kind of stuck with it depending on your circumstances. And I'm very happy to report nothing of the sort was a problem. I've used a lot of converging 0 on this, and almost exclusively, honestly, and I can say with a great deal of confidence there is no real issue there. The only thing that you sort of have to get used to with this is exactly where your hold is and exactly what cant you need to be at close ranges to avoid a super high right hold or something like that. So if you want that 12 o'clock hold, you're going to have to adjust your cant a little bit, collect a little bit of dope, and make sure that you're good as far as a 12 o'clock hold is concerned, and then practice that so that you can actually get it in place and get a good 12 o'clock hold on the 0 at close ranges. That said, is that a real issue? No. What I do have an issue with is this turntable. Okay, cycling between different modes is obviously not a problem at all. And for the target market, for the most part, right, this makes sense, but you start running into real issues if your normal guy tries to use this. And here's what I mean by this. For the guys that are doing the really high speed raids and that sort of stuff, this makes perfect sense. Yeah, obviously you can run into environmental issues and that sort of stuff, but generally speaking, what these guys are not doing is the same thing as your regular Joe that is occupying a position that people have forgot about ages ago. And what I mean by that is this, right? Anybody that has worn a green suit and a set of boots that is not in special operations or something similar can relate to this. Because if I say something like NTC, that makes a lot of sense for guys. Because you remember the dust storms that pipe up randomly. You remember Connex Planet. You remember getting bead blasted by sandstorms and that sort of stuff that just happen in a place like that. And in these environments, this thing does not do as hot. Now, I will say right away, I've never been at a point where the controls on this were unusable, but I have noticed enough of an issue to where I'm feeling stuff bind up pretty bad, where if I'm trying to cycle between different modes, I can really hear that crunchy sound. While this didn't actually stop me from doing things, I can certainly see that if I was more distracted by more things to do, or if I just didn't have the ability to take that cap off and service it, get all the crunchy stuff out of there, put it back together and keep it moving, or didn't have the ability to get on my little slider with my Trijicon ACOG lens pen that I got from the first TA01 I ever bought and get in there and brush stuff off, that could persist into larger issues. And honestly, I'm not the only one that's had this sort of experience. There's been more than one report of these control surfaces, or at the very least the main one that cycles between your modes, actually locking up because of severe weather issues. Another environment that I've had issues with this in is, like, I was in a Florida unit for a long time, right? And I've been in similar environments since then, so this always sticks up in my mind because you imagine, you know, the point in time where it's been raining a little bit on and off, right? Where you're in like a true tropical environment where it beats the brakes off of you for a while and then it goes away and it's boiling hot now. Or you're just in swampy environments where you take one wrong step and now I'm up into my neck in just garbage, and you pull yourself out of that and you have that little moment on the inside that's like, good God, just give me a break, right? In an environment like that, I have had similar issues with this thing wanting to not work as good as it should, and then having to be really conscious of the fact that, okay, I got to take this cap off and service it again. Now, again, I've never run into an issue that has forced me to be like, well, this doesn't work at all, but some guys have had it worse than me, so these are just things to pay attention to in that regard. The other issue that I have with this has to do with middle grounding, right? And here's what I mean by this. This thing is superior if I'm inside of structures. It just is. I have never run into a unit that was better at doing that than this unit, for instance. And at medium rifle distances, right? So we're talking 100, 200, 300. This thing is excellent. There is a zone, though, that is not that great with this, and let me explain that. So, for instance, a lot of people really criticize, like, Holosun LS321, D-Ball A3, because their illuminator power is not that great. And then you have guys that are at the very center of the galaxy of people that don't know what they're talking about, making little videos about how they're in a light-polluted area, which is actually a great environment for this, really. So, like a suburb, for instance, right? and then they're like, wow, look at this illuminator power, it's not that great. And they shine it into dark zones and stuff like that, or like the one little dark zone that they can find in this light polluted area. And the really funny thing about that is that when you take these lower power illuminators and then shine them into areas like that, into areas that are darker with areas that have lots of light pollution, and they're like, wow, you can't see a whole lot. And what's really funny about that in particular is they don't take into account that one of the least IR compliant things on Earth is your face and your eyes, right? So if you are looking for a human being that has these exposed, it's going to illuminate that dude like a friggin' Christmas tree, and you can see very well what's going on. Now, in darker environments, right, what this has a tendency to do for you is that as far as distances that equate essentially from house clearing distance out to about 50-60 yards, you can see a great deal of detail on a person that's moving around, and especially what they're doing with their hands. So if you're in environments that just really don't want you to punch holes in the wrong dudes, which is all of them, the ability to really see those details is very important. Now, why am I bringing this up to begin with? Well, the issue that the MAWL has is that with the modes that are provided, there's this zone where if you hit it with the standard mode, it's overpainting your object quite a bit. Now, is this a really big deal for guys that are in DevGru or that are in Saber Troop or 2nd Ranger Battalion or whatever? Likely no, because they have probably cleared more buildings than you've entered. You, meaning the person watching this. So there's tons of experience involved in just being able to discern those details and that sort of stuff, but guys that are in those outfits will likely have a story or two about how they get around these issues, and likely, usually, it's with lower power modes. How you get around this with this particular unit is you just don't, because the flood is really great until you get to about 20-25 yards, and then after the first 2 rounds you fire, the smoke that you put out from the rifle is gonna get detected by the illuminator, and it's gonna make it really, really hard to see, and you're not really illuminating anything anyway at those distances. So you're sort of stuck in this middle ground of essentially min-maxing between really short range and then medium rifle distance. Now, is this impossible? Is this a thing that is really, really difficult to overcome? Does this make this impossible to use at these distances? Absolutely not. It's just a thing that I have personally noticed. And grand scheme of things, it isn't the biggest deal ever. But what I will say is that at those particular distances, which I would argue for lots of guys that use night vision is most of the time, that's when I need to see things the most, you know, and can you work around it? Sure, but easier is easier. Realistically speaking, especially with price tags, should you go buy one of these things? Look, in newer versions of this, there may very well be an exact answer to exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is exactly this. If you are in your standard mode, and if your lower powered button is basically like the D-Ball A3 mode, the civilian D-Ball A3 mode, or the Holosun LS321 mode, this thing would be perfect all the way across the board as far as controls, usability, the ability to not overpaint targets at any distance, basically. It would be perfect for all of those things. But now we have progressed a little bit, right? And as far as emerging technologies and that sort of stuff. So even if, because this is an older unit, and from what I understand, newer released versions of this are programmable. That said, even if that is the case, with the stuff that's coming out now, I really can't recommend this at all at this point, because you have other units that are out there. Let's still say expensive. There are units that are out there that are like $2,000 that do more than this thing does, functionality-wise, which is not that great because this thing is like a $3,000 unit. And now you have guys like Laser Speed that are coming out with some pretty decent stuff as far as power output. And what attracts my brain more than anything else at this point, actually, is the Holosun Iris, because it does have a LS321 mode and a full power mode, and you can adjust your illumination to quite tight if you need it for greater distances, which I understand you wouldn't use that generally speaking, but that's just as a for instance. And they still have all the same functionality as far as everything is slaved together, and we got pretty good weatherproofing at this point, and honestly, like I said, you know, all these other units have had enough time to observe the technological landscape of what it is that we're looking at, and then they come in lighter than the MAWL by a lot, and then, worse than that, they come in far far less expensive. If it were me, and if I'm recommending this to guys that are buying units especially for the first time, absolutely not. I would not recommend going and getting a MAWL basically ever at this point. And if you already have one, is it worth it to sell it? You could argue yes or no. Somebody is gonna want to buy it from you, and you can probably make a bunch of money and then outfit 2 guns with 2 different lasers based off of what you pick up, or outfit 1 gun and then a bunch of extra doodads / bullets. But as far as merits of the unit itself, it's still really solid. It's still really well engineered. It's very, very tough. It's serviceable. It does exactly what it's supposed to. And yeah, there are some quirks now, but all this really is at this point is it's quirks from older technology. And yeah, what I'm alluding to is that this thing is rapidly approaching big, heavy, old dinosaur land that gets essentially outdone by modern technology. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But is it so bad that you should look at the unit that you have on the gun at home and be like, I need to get rid of this thing right now? No, because those that already have these on board the gun, again, it's a solid unit, but now we just have more to think about now. So if you're thinking about outfitting multiple guns with night vision stuff, this ain't it, Chief. There's just stuff that we can use now that's caught up as far as the technological gap is concerned that don't have to be as heavy and are more flexible. So that is what it is. But if you want to support us through Patreon, you absolutely can do that. If you want to come train with us, you absolutely can do that, because we are scheduled out through December at this point. And if you want to follow the rest of our little social media stuff, the links for all of this are in the description below. If you want to get a little bit more out of your Patreon membership, $41 a month gets you as much training as you want with us, so long as it is in a private class or a soft skin vehicle class for logistics impact alone, and that's fairly obvious as far as why that's the case. Yes, I do private classes, and you can reach out to me to schedule one. And as always, if and only if you enjoyed this particular video, you can give us a like, a subscribe, share it around, get our little message out there to everybody that you know. And remember, guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.